Good evening and welcome to you all. Thanks for your patience. We did just make a start on the tea backstage just to get in the mood. It's the first of a new series of London talks being chaired here by the Conway Hall Ethical Society, and I was delighted to be asked to chair them. And the first one, seems to me to sum up exactly what the talks are supposed to be about important and passionately held subjects and views. Shouting Back is the title. I'm not sure quite how our speakers view the theme, so I'll be interested to hear how you choose to respond to it. But I'm very much looking forward to hearing their presentations. They're going to speak for 15 minutes each. Then I'm going to lead a discussion before opening it up for your questions, so do prepare some great ones. So, just to introduce our speakers, for those of you who may not know who they are, but I suspect you do because that's why you're here. Laura Bates and Caroline Criado-Perez have high-profile campaigns around women's equality and fair treatment. Laura's Everyday Sexism tweet feed has shared individual stories of sexual harassment and bullying, and it's built up a kind of real international presence and is something that women all over the world are now taking part in. I'm also struck by how you've also been helping challenge the whole imbalance of male to female speakers on news programs, and I think the women's room... sorry, that's Caroline's. Sorry. Slightly cut and pasted in the wrong place there. But I think it's fair to say that the whole idea of raising the profile of proper representation in how feminism is debated and how women's rights are debated is something that both of you do. And I know that Caroline's campaign to keep a woman on our banknotes was successful, and I want to ask a bit about that later because I think how it was handled by the government is quite interesting. Both our speakers have proved articulate debaters in the news media. And Caroline, I was struck by how more recently you have openly questioned something which I guess I hadn't really thought about, but we'd all known was there, the lack of mothers' names and professions on marriage certificates, which effectively has banished women from historical records, which when you think about our modern obsession with who we think we are, is really remarkable. It's a sad fact that at times both our speakers have had to deal with, threats and abuse, and much directed via social media. And I think, inevitably, they will have to be a part of our discussion, which is about feminists having to shout back. But this is something, having seen Oh, What a Lovely War, the film, quite recently, there's an amazing scene where, I think it's one of the Pankhurst sisters, is talking about the war and being shouted down by men just about what a woman should be, and they don't want to listen to the issues. I'm not saying it's a comfort, but I think it's interesting how long people have tried to counter feminism by just shouting women down, and I'm delighted that you're both here. So I want to ask Caroline first to give us your presentation.
Okay. Right, thank you very much. I'm just going to stand here, I think. It seems like I'm not in the way here. Okay, so I'm just going to run extremely quickly because I've only got 15 minutes and it's a huge topic about why I think, although it's often dismissed as something that's quite trivial, why I think the representation of women is actually a really fundamental part of 21st century feminism. So obviously I'm not going to be able to cover everything or even most things, but hopefully I'll be able to spark off some thoughts. So I just want to start off by giving you a picture of the representation of women today, mainly in the UK, but also around the world a little bit. So there's our wonderful parliament. There are just under 5 men for every woman in Westminster Parliament. It's actually a bit better in the Scottish Parliament, where it's just under 3 men for every woman. And the reason I want to tell you that is that what I think is really interesting is that even after accounting for the fact that there are just more of them, so obviously they speak more, the women are speaking more in the Scottish Parliament. So the more women that you have, the more likely they are to speak, essentially. Out of 107 High Court judges, only 20 are women. And today a Council of Europe report was released showing that only 25% of judges overall are women, and that puts us third last before only Azerbaijan and Armenia. So that's good. Key stage 2 of the national history curriculum. That does not have any women at all in it. Women just did not exist for stage 2 of the national history curriculum. There are only 4 in stage 3, and they're all grouped together under the changing role of women, rather than men who get to be, categorized under whatever their various fields were. So that's stupid. Out of 13 editors of daily national newspapers, only 1 is a woman, and that's actually decreased from a splendid high of 17% about 3 years ago. And 78% of news stories are written by men. And what I should point out about the high of 17% is, although it is woeful, the point is it's actually decreased. So that's an example of how things don't necessarily always get better. Women don't make the front pages. Well, apart from, as you can see, occasionally we do, or in fact, very often when it's this kind of picture, which is a picture that's called a lift, and it's not actually deemed relevant to a news story, we make up 80% of those pictures, so we're doing really well there. But on any given day, the lead stories, so the actual content that's considered important, has an 84% chance of being about men. Can I just remind you, women are 51% of the population. And if there's an expert quoted, there's an 80% chance he'll be a man. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's just reflecting the world as it is, and, you know, as women get more equal and maybe get a bit more educated, because we're very uneducated at the moment, so obviously we're not experts, maybe we'll appear in the news media a bit more than 20% of the time. That's not actually true. So, recent research in the UK media, for example, on political stories, has shown that men outnumber women by 10 to 1. And as I said, men outnumber women in the Westminster Parliament by just under 5 to 1. So it's bad, but it's not that bad. So the media is representing it as worse than it actually is. More examples on global news stories that affect women disproportionately more than men. For example, on HIV and AIDS, women make up only 42% of news subjects. This goes down to 30% when the story is about female electoral candidates. And I don't really know how they did that, to be honest. 30% for stories about people who are women. Anyway, the issue of representation, as I think I slightly hinted at before when I said we were 80% of pretty pictures, isn't always about women being underrepresented. It's also sometimes about us being overrepresented. And again, this is about pictures again. Female subjects of global news stories were more likely to appear in photographs. This is according, all these global stats, by the way, are from the Global Media Monitoring Project, who do an entire scan of the global news media every 5 years. So these are all from their latest report. Female subjects of global news stories were more likely to appear in photographs accompanying the article than men. And when they were pictured, men were more likely just to have headshots, whereas women were much more likely to be full body, and in the words of the Global Media Monitoring Project, in various states of undress. And of course, as you will all know, I've even seen someone wearing a No More Page 3 t-shirt today, woohoo! On pretty much any weekday you will have a woman basically just in her pants on page 3 for no reason other than here's a woman in her pants. Okay, so, and actually this focus on women's looks affects us much even more than the sort of traditional thing we talk about, which is women's self-confidence, and we all feel terrible because no one looks like a page 3 model. Not even page 3 models. I have it on good authority. Anyway, so it affects us more than self-confidence. There's a really interesting study that recently came out of the US, which found that just mentioning a female politician's appearance, whether it was positive, negative, or even neutral, so for example, she was wearing a blue jacket and, you know, I don't know what else people wear, trousers, that would have a negative impact on the polls. Voters were less likely to think she was experienced, strong, effective, qualified, and confident, just by a newspaper mentioning what she was wearing. So you can imagine the effect of something like the recent Daily Mail spread on the Downing Street catwalk, where all the women were rated on what they were wearing and where it came from, and how nice it was they were walking on a catwalk when they're on their way to work. Anyway, Hollywood is another terrible one. I'm just going to remind you before I tell you these stats, women are 51% of the population. In Hollywood, films were 28% of the population, 28% of speaking roles, and only 17% of crowd scenes. And those percentages haven't changed for 16 years. So again, there's this issue of people saying, oh, well, it'll just get better over time. No, it doesn't. Not unless you push. Or shout back. Anyway. What I find quite interesting about that 17% stat, obviously, correlation doesn't equal causation and all that. We're at a skeptical meeting here. But 17% is the same percentage as men think, so when there's a mixed group, if there's 17% women in the group, men think that it's 50-50 men and women. And once it's 33%, men think women are in the majority. So I think that's really interesting, and I think that, there may be something in the fact that, we're seeing all these crowd scenes in TV. The 17 actually is a percentage that comes up quite a lot. There's 17% of heart surgeons in the US It's a figure that repeatedly comes up on women's representation, so there's something interesting going on there. Anyway, so yeah, what is actually going on here? Why, when women make up 51% of the population, I'm sorry to labour the point, but it is so ridiculous that we make 28% of speaking roles, do we represent that world as 70 to 80% male? You will not be surprised to know I have a theory about this. So I'd like to introduce you to a concept called the male default. So here we have two frames that are exactly the same, except in the left-hand frame it's two men, and in the right-hand frame it's audience participation, a man and a woman. Can't tell men and women. Okay, so this cartoon's by CKD, and obviously it's this funny send-up of the double standard where men tend to be only expected to represent themselves as individuals, and women are seen as representatives from Planet Woman, and we're all the same. So one woman can represent all of womanhood. But what actually I find particularly interesting about this cartoon is it demonstrates how unthinkingly we accept the idea that male humans are the standard from which females deviate. So here the man is represented by the standard stick figure, or the female stick figure has something added onto it to make her different, and therefore a woman. So for example, you could imagine the male stick figures having beards. Why don't we do that? Why is it always the woman who has something added onto her? And why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because this is an anti-sexist cartoon. And not only is it an anti-sexist cartoon, it's actually an anti-sexist cartoon that is focusing on the idea of male being seen as default, and we're still falling into these sexist tropes. So I think it just underscores how incredibly underlined this idea is that male is default and female is somehow deviant. Anyway, I just want to show you some other examples of how this works. This is pretty self-explanatory. Lego time teacher clock, Lego time teacher girl clock. I don't know if you can read that, but that says awesome girl and that says awesome kid. Deodorant, women's deodorant. This is one of my favourite things that has ever come out. So, you know, all that time we thought we were using gender-neutral pens. It turned out they were men's pens. So we needed to get our glittery pink versions for our delicate lady hands. And you might be surprised to know that the default Bic pens have not been relabeled Bic for men. So yeah, that's interesting. This is a recent news story that it really made me stop and think, actually. So this is from New Zealand a couple of weeks ago. That's meant to represent Kate Shepherd, who is a New Zealand suffragist. New Zealand was the first country to introduce suffrage for women in 1893. But the reason I found it particularly interesting was it suddenly made me think, God, that's something I've never even thought of. And you know, I'm someone who, as you can see, is a bit obsessed with male default and thinks about it all the time. And it had never occurred to me, there's nothing wrong with that. It suddenly occurred to me that, God, that's a little green man, and I've never noticed that. I've just thought it's green human. So again, I think that just sort of shows how ingrained this is. And come on, you're not going to pretend to me that you've ever thought that's a green woman. You've always thought it's a little green man who says that you can walk. So, okay. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because it all adds up to a world where women are not seen as 50% of the human population, but as an anomaly, a deviation from standard humanity, which is represented by men. And beyond being annoying, this can actually have some very serious consequences. So until April this year, the vast majority of animals used by medical researchers to develop new drugs and treatments in the US were male. And this has caused a whole host of problems because the female body is actually not just the male body with some ovaries tacked on, it actually functions in some very different ways. And so by not testing these drugs on women, women have tended to have much more severe side effects and much less effective treatment. So just to give you some examples, in 2013, so last year, the FDA had to change the recommended dosage of a very popular sleeping pill that had been prescribed for a very long time because they had found out that women actually metabolize the active ingredient much more slowly than men. They told women they had to cut the dosage in half. So women were metabolizing it, I would extrapolate from that 50% slower. Scientists may disagree with me. Anyway, it seems like a lot. Another example is statins, which are regularly prescribed to pretty much anyone over the age of 60 because it's been shown to be very successful in lowering cholesterol, although actually it's only really been tested in men and there's very little evidence of its effectiveness in treatment for women. And a quite scary example that my attention was drawn to when I read a blog by Joy Gomar, who I think is here tonight, is the example of a heart attack. And certainly I thought that I knew what the symptoms of a heart attack were, which are pain on the left arm, and squeezing painful feeling in the chest. I don't know how many of you thought that. I certainly have been brought up to think that that is a symptom of a heart attack, and if I feel that, I should get myself to a doctor's stat. Actually, that's a classic male heart attack sign, and a female heart attack feels a lot more like indigestion. And studies have shown that actually a lot of doctors are still diagnosing women who've had heart attacks with either indigestion or with pulled muscles, which obviously isn't ideal if you've just had a heart attack. And just one more example of it in the sort of medical sphere. The other day I read about a revolutionary new pacemaker that was being introduced. Woohoo! Unfortunately, this pacemaker, again, has been tested mainly in men, and it is 80% effective for men. No, actually, I can't remember how effective it is for men. It's very effective for men. The problem is, it's only 20% effective for women. And I can't help wondering, if this were only 20% effective for men, would we be introducing this as a revolutionary new pacemaker, or would we say this is clearly unfit for purpose? Anyway, just to give you another example from outside the medical sphere, where male default actually has a seriously detrimental effect on women, is with female asylum seekers. So the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees is a beautiful document, and it had great intentions. It was designed to enable those who are persecuted around the world to be granted refuge elsewhere. And there are lots of things that you can say are causing you to be persecuted. Sexuality, political beliefs, religion, social group, but not gender. And when women refugees are asked why they are seeking asylum, the number one response that they give is, because I'm a woman. There are other issues too. Someone can only claim asylum once they're out of the country already, but that basic requirement is of course much harder for women, many of whom are much less likely to be in paid work, so it's much harder for them to get a visa to travel legally. Also, a lot of them are coming from countries where it's either frowned upon or illegal for women to travel on their own. They need to travel with a male guardian, and quite often it's the male guardian that they'll be fleeing from. So there are these huge obstacles to women even getting into a position where they can claim asylum. And I just want to illustrate how this plays out in reality by telling you about Nausea Atmar, who I recently interviewed for a book I've just finished writing. Nausea was one of several women who was voted into the Afghan parliament after Taliban rule was ended. And together, those women managed to pass some brilliant laws to tackle violence against women. And while she was serving, she met and she married a man who told her he supported her work. Unfortunately, she lost her seat in her second term due to corruption. And at that point, she became a prisoner in her own home. Her husband beat her, he raped her, he held a knife to her throat, he threatened to kill her. And she eventually decided that she had to leave him. Unfortunately, her family and he both threatened to kill her if she did, so she had to go into hiding. And when I interviewed her, she told me that she'd approached the British Embassy to ask them to help her. And they'd said that they couldn't help her because if they helped one woman who was suffering from domestic violence, it would open the floodgates. And this was a perfectly legal response for them to give because actually domestic violence isn't an example of persecution under which you can claim asylum. So, turn on a slightly more jolly note. Essentially, representation is all to do, in my opinion, with perspective, how women are perceived and what we perceive as important. So when Nausea was in Parliament, violence against women became an issue the government cared about. Our government seems to find it a slightly more minor issue. Between 2010 and 2013, in the UK, women's services were cut by 30%, and that figure rises to 47% for black and minority ethnic women. And of course, as any women's services worker could tell you, in a time of austerity, demand rises. This has led to last year a situation where on average 180 women were turned away every single day from refuges in the UK. And according to research by Karen and Gala Smith, who's been counting all the women killed by men in the UK for the past 3 years, because again, our government doesn't actually think this data is worth collecting, a woman was killed by a man every 2.38 days this year. So, what day is it today? Thursday. How many women have been killed so far this week? I'm bad at maths. Is that 2? Anyway, women have died this week. And between April and September this year, 3 women were beheaded by men in London alone. 3 women in London beheaded. Now, I'm not saying that having women represented in the media or more women in Hollywood would suddenly stop women being killed or cause governments to start shaping policies that prevent violence against women. But what I am saying is that a world that's designed around the male experience is dangerous for women and continually lets them down. And ensuring that women are fairly represented as 51% of the population and with their own specific needs, not just as a niche interest group, is a key way of changing that. Thank you.
when's your book going to be published?
Oh, not till May next
And
year.
what's it going to be called? We can look out.
Do It Like a Woman.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thank you. Standing ovation.
Laura, just before you go up, just in case I forget to say it later, you have a book out now, Everyday Sexism.
Yeah.
And Laura will be signing copies if you want to buy a copy afterwards. Do remember that. But please, over to you.
Thank you. Can everyone... Oh, there's a bright light. Hang on, I'm just going to position myself. Can everybody see me okay if I stand here? Great. So I want to outline, I've been asked to outline essentially a kind of what is the problem and hopefully what is the solution sort of approach. So that's my plan. And to do that, I need to talk to you about the Everyday Sexism Project, because that's how I've become aware and how I've gathered evidence about what the problem is. I started the project really almost by mistake after a series of escalating incidents, being followed home off the bus by a man who was really aggressive, sexually propositioning me, wouldn't take no for an answer, being shouted at by men in the street, being groped by a man on the bus, and finding that when I told my mum, who I was on the phone to, what had happened, when I said out loud, I'm on the bus, this man's groping me, everybody on the bus heard, and everybody on the bus looked out the window. Everybody looked away. Not only did nobody step in or try and help, but there was even more than that, a sense of why are you bringing this into the public domain? A sense that there was something wrong with me for bringing it up, for making a fuss, something that made me feel embarrassed and ashamed and like I shouldn't have been there, and all the feelings that he should have been experiencing. And I had a moment kind of at the end of this week of sort of odd things happening where I sort of sat down and thought about them. And the thing that really hit me was that if they hadn't happened so close together, I never would have thought twice about any one of them that had happened on its own, because it was so normal. And it made me think about all the other similar things that had happened like that over the course of the past months and years that I'd never brought up, never mentioned to anyone, where I just put my head down and carried on walking because it was just the way things were. And I started talking to other women and girls and asking them, have you ever experienced anything like this? And I honestly thought that maybe a few of them would have a story to tell me, you know, that it would be a few years ago this happened, or I had this job once. And it wasn't like that at all. It was completely overwhelming. It was every woman I spoke to. And it was on my way to meet you today, this happened. Yesterday, this happened. How long have you got? But just like me, so many of them made a point of telling me, do you know, actually, until you asked me, I'd never told anyone any of those stories because it was just kind of normal. It was just the way things were. So I started trying to talk about it, and I came up against a very interesting response, which was that I was really frequently shut down with the answer, no, there's no such thing as sexism anymore, because women are equal now, everything's fine. And because of that idea, if you're talking about sexism, you know, you're making a fuss about nothing, you've got your knickers in a twist, you need to learn to get a sense of humor, he probably meant it as a compliment, you've taken it the wrong way. You know, those kinds of things that women hear again and again and again that contribute to people not feeling able to tell these stories. So I looked into it. I thought that, you know, perhaps people were right. Maybe I was making a fuss about nothing. Maybe everything was fine. And what I found when I looked into it, which I won't tell you all of because Caroline's already told you lots of them, were those incredible statistics about women's underrepresentation throughout this society in which we are supposedly so equal. The massive underrepresentation of women in Parliament, the fact that only 8 out of 37 Lord Justices of Appeal are women and 18 out of 108 High Court judges. Statistics that I think probably most of us sort of in the backs of our mind just would have assumed were roughly 50-50, or, you know, maybe a slightly fewer women than men. And it was in every field I looked into, and I realized, because of the aggression of some of these responses I was getting, that if I went back with these stats about politics and law and science, then I would have people saying, okay, but, you know, men dominate in certain areas because men are more interested in those areas, and actually there'll be other areas where women dominate. So I looked into the areas where I thought people might say that. I looked into the arts, and I found that it's been over 13 years since a female choreographer was commissioned to create a piece for the main stage at our Royal Opera House, that it was reported in 2010 that out of 2,300 works, our National Gallery contains paintings by just 10 women, and that out of 573 listed statues around the UK commemorating people of interest and inspiration, only 15% of them are of women. And I looked into the media and found the same stats that you've already heard from Caroline about women writing front page headlines, women appearing on the front pages. And I looked into statistics around violence and found that there's a phone call to the police every minute about domestic violence, that every 6 minutes a woman is raped, adding up to over 85,000 rapes and 400,000 sexual assaults every year. And that here in England and Wales, a woman has a 1 in 4 chance of becoming a victim of domestic violence and a 1 in 5 chance of becoming the victim of a sexual offence. So I felt like that argument, women are equal now, so it's all fine, didn't really stand up to scrutiny, but I also felt like there wasn't any point trying to tackle it while people didn't believe that there was a problem. So I started Everyday Sexism really to try and prove the problem, to try and give other people the experience I'd had of hearing all those stories together and starting to realise just how massive the problem really was, and how much worse than the sexist joke or the odd wolf whistle that I think was in a lot of people's minds when they heard the word sexism. And the stories started to absolutely flood in. And we heard from women of all ages, from women around the world, from women from all walks of life. We heard from a woman who worked in the city who was told to sit on her boss's lap if she wanted her Christmas bonus. From a woman working in a video store who found that every time she went up the ladder to get fresh stock from the storeroom, her boss would smack her on the bum. And when she came down, he'd just look down her top and say, "You know why I hired you." We heard from a female reverend in the Church of England who found that she was constantly being asked if there was a man available to perform the wedding or the funeral, but always that it was nothing personal. We heard from a vet who was told that she wasn't allowed to touch a prized racehorse because it could only be treated. We heard from a woman who was a captain of a boat who was told by her male crew that they simply wouldn't sail under her. We heard from women who were talking about turning up at university and being sexually harassed in lecture halls. We heard from girls of 14 or 15 who said it was just normal, they used the word normal, that about once every couple of weeks in the tube on their way to school, somebody would rub up against them with an erection or start stroking their legs or sit down next to them and start touching them. We heard from so many girls about the things that they were experiencing at school, things that I think most people would be completely shocked to hear, but which are so incredibly invisible and silenced. And in terms of trying to, in a very sort of short 15 minutes, sum up what the problem is, I think there's a couple of things that I want to pull out and focus on. And the first thing is that the problem is incredibly, incredibly connected. There's one thing that's become really clear from the project entries we've received, is that it's not possible to say, this is street harassment over here, and this is the problems about the portrayal of women in the media over here, and this is what women are facing in the workplace over here, because those things naturally have a massive impact on one another. And also crucially, that it's not possible, as some people would like, to say these are the things that we accept are valid women's issues to discuss. These are the serious things like rape and domestic violence, which we accept are problems. And then over here, there's things like street harassment, which we don't consider to be a problem. There's things like pregnancy-related discrimination, which we don't really believe in. It was so clear that it wasn't possible to look at them in that way. So, for example, we would hear from a woman who'd been sexually harassed verbally in the street, who'd been told, get on with it, don't make a fuss, what's the big deal? And the same words and phrases had been used to describe her as had been used to a woman in the workplace who was being discriminated against, who ended up losing her job. Or, for example, we'd see how something that might have been considered something that you should just brush off and not make a fuss about would escalate into one of those forms of sexism, one of those forms of misogyny that it was apparently acceptable to take a stand against. Like the woman who tried to ignore some men who were catcalling her and found that they followed her home and sexually assaulted her just in front of her front door. And it became really clear that if we're going to tackle this, it has to be about tackling it, I think, at every level. This kind of goes into this idea of solutions and what the solutions are. I don't think there's any point fixing women's political representation if we don't address the fact that the media carries on portraying female politicians as sex objects. I don't think it will solve things to have a quota to get more women into Parliament if, when they're promoted, we have another fiasco of the catwalk of the Downing Street cuties. I think that these problems are so closely interrelated, and I think it's attitudinal as well. So I think that it doesn't make sense to say, well, it's okay for men to shout about women's breasts in the street as they're walking down the road. That's not that big a deal, that's acceptable, but discrimination in the workplace is wrong, because that man is walking down the street on his way to the workplace where he'll be interacting with women. And if we teach people that those things are acceptable, that in some areas of society it's okay to see women as second-class citizens, it's okay to treat them as objects, it's okay to set up that power dynamic where what a man wants is very much what comes first, where a woman is there absolutely to be subjugated to the man's will and what he thinks, then we can't expect people to kind of shut off that area of their brain when they go into the other parts of the society where we've decided that it is a valid problem to deal with. I think it's really important to recognize and to talk about the fact that those things that we're not meant to talk about, that we're not meant to make a fuss about, like street harassment, like page 3, contribute to the ideas and attitudes that underlie some of the more serious offences. But in terms of concrete, what can we do? What can we actually physically do? One of the really exciting things that's come out of everyday sexism is that we found that there have been concrete ways that we've been able to take action. So because we've now received 80,000 entries, we've been able to start taking them and using them for really specific ends. For example, the entries that we get from schoolgirls, we've been able to start taking and going into schools, going into universities and talking to young people directly about gender inequality, about healthy relationships, about consent. We took a whole batch of the entries that were just from women experiencing sexual offences on public transport and took them to the British Transport Police, who were already looking at ways that they could be better at tackling sexual offences with an initiative called Project Guardian. And what was really interesting was that they knew it was happening, and we had thousands of these entries, but almost all of them weren't being reported to the police because of that normalization, because of that belittling sense of this is just the way things are, don't make a fuss. And that's something so interesting because a huge number of what these people were reporting was sexual assault. And sexual assault under UK law is somebody touching you, doesn't specify where on your body, and the touching is sexual, you don't consent, and the person doesn't reasonably believe that you consented. It's that simple. And yet when I go into universities and I talk to young women, they say, you know, it's a normal part of a night out for them that somebody will grab their breasts, grab their bums, stick a hand between their legs. They'd never use the word sexual assault to describe that. They'd never consider taking it to the police. And the same thing was happening on public transport, that there was this massive gap between what we were teaching women to put up with, to accept, to deal with as the norm, and what they were actually protected from. And so we were able to send that message to the police to look at really breaking down those incidents into separate categories. It wasn't just people being groped, it was people being followed. It was women having photographs taken up their skirts on escalators. It was men exposing themselves. And they retrained 2,000 of their officers to look at the way that they dealt with sexual offences. And then we went back and used social media, which is another kind of interesting aspect of all of this, to let women know that we'd done that, to let them know that we'd talked to the police and that the police would take things seriously and that they could report them. And so far that initiative has raised reporting of sexual offences on public transport in London by over 25% and the detection of offenders by about 30%. So I think that there are kind of concrete actions that we can take. We can use the tools that are available to us. We can go and kind of take concrete action in that way. But I also think we need to demand change from people who are in a position to make change happen for everybody. So for example, I can go into schools once, twice, 3 times a week and speak to 300 or 400 young people at a time, but the government could guarantee that every child in the country gets compulsory education about healthy relationships, about consent, about things like online porn. And that's something that's just too important to leave to chance. So I think that there is still a lot that we can ask the government of. There's a lot of specific things like the recent tribunal fees, which mean that now if a woman wants to take her employer to a workplace tribunal for sexual harassment, she has to pay an upfront fee of up to £1,200. Since those fees came in, the number of tribunal cases being taken has plummeted by 80%. And the excuse for it, the excuse that was given, was that this would weed out claims that were spurious. It would stop people from making things up, essentially, all those pesky women making things up again. But in reality, if that was the case, then you would expect to see that after the fees were brought in, the number of successful cases would go up, right? If it was just filtering out all those silly women making things up. In reality, there's been almost no change at all in the number of successful cases. So I think there are specific things that we can demand of figures of authority. But I think that when it comes down to it very, very specifically, the nitty-gritty thing that we need most of all is a cultural shift. And it's not a very glamorous thing to ask for because it's not something that's easy and specific and that you can kind of put in a nutshell. But essentially, I feel like there are lots of similarities here between feminism and what it's trying to achieve and between climate change and climate change activists. It's something that we actually could really make a massive difference to if everybody got involved right now, if everybody took part. It's something that everybody actually has the ability to shift within their own sphere of experience, within their own little world. But it's also something that won't work if only about 10% of people have a go. It doesn't make that much difference if only a few people are recycling religiously, but everybody else is chucking their milk carton in the bin. And it's the same, I think, with this, because it has to be about what's considered culturally normal, what's considered acceptable. It has to be about the fact that it was normal for everybody on that bus that night to look away, to look out of the window. It has to be about the attitudes of what is and isn't okay. And that has to start with everybody. It has to start with individuals. And there's certain things that we can do to try and prompt it. So, for example, in 2013, we got a lot of reports that people were finding images on Facebook that were specifically promoting and sort of glorifying rape and domestic violence. And Facebook at the time didn't have a policy about gendered hate speech. It had policies for things like anti-Semitic content, racist content, homophobic content, but it didn't accept that this was a form of gendered hate speech. And so we were able to launch a campaign and again draw on that social media side of things. And we got lots of big companies who were advertising on Facebook to recognize that their adverts were appearing alongside these really graphic and very misogynistic images, and to tell Facebook that they stood with us and that they would remove their advertising if Facebook didn't take action. And Facebook did, within a week, agree to change its policies on rape and domestic violence content. So I hope that things like that can help, things like raising awareness, things like making those kinds of shifts can help with the idea of social change, because somewhere on the other side of the world, a 14-year-old boy might try and upload a picture of a woman with a black eye and a joke about how funny it is to hit her, and he'll get the message from the framework of his norm, which is Facebook, that that's not acceptable, that that's not okay. But it's also something that has to come from us, that has to come from us individually, whether it's talking to the people around us, whether it's educating our boys about consent and not just our girls, whether it's standing up in the office when somebody else is experiencing discrimination, whether it's being the person that steps in the street when we see sexual harassment and stops it happening, until somebody on the bus stands up and says that's not okay, and transfers that feeling of shame and this is socially unacceptable and I'm embarrassed because everybody else is saying this is unacceptable to the perpetrator, I don't think that we can move forward.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on what you'd both said for about 15 minutes, and then we'll take about a good half hour of questions. But first, I mean, I was struck by the number of things that you've actively worked on, both of you. And maybe Laura first, when you talked about just things like London Transport for London's policy on harassment. I mean, how many people able to do? How much time do you have, or do you have people that you're working with on this?
Well, we partner with different organisations around different issues. So with the British Transport Police, we were working with the End Violence Against Women Coalition and with Hollaback London, and you kind of support one another in that way. I'm also so lucky to have an incredible network of volunteers who help with the project, with running it online. So we have branches now in 20 countries worldwide, which all have local ownership, women in those countries who moderate the project, who use it there in their local media and with their local politicians. But also a massive team of people who copy across the entries that we get on Twitter into the website. So I do have incredible support in that way.
And Karen, I was struck by your work on kind of campaigning about representation on things like, you know, media programs. How much of that is just you on social media, and how far, again, are you getting people who are saying, even if they're not people you may have known before, just, you know, is it about building a groundswell, or in the end, actually, is it because you've just got it going and then the momentum takes care of itself?
Well, I think, you know, no one person can do everything. I think what's really, I read a really beautiful quotation the other day by Liz Kelly, who is an amazing feminist, works on violence against women. And she said that feminism's like a tapestry and every woman brings her own thread. And I really think it's like that. One woman might have an idea, she might say this is wrong, but what is incredibly beautiful and amazing, and I know Laura feels the same, is that once you've said that, you'll find all these people saying, actually, I agree with you, this is wrong, how can I help? I've had so many people get in touch with me saying, how can I help? Unfortunately, usually I'm too busy to reply to the email, but the thought is there, and certainly, with the Women's Room, I've had wonderful support from women who helped me run the Twitter account, and, when we were trying to raise money for the banknotes campaign so we could take the Bank of England to court, there were loads of women who volunteered to tweet to help keep the thing running, because I was actually trying to do a dissertation, doing masters at the time, so it was, not really ideal.
Can I ask a bit more specifically about that campaign and then the subsequent one that you're engaged at the moment about marriage licenses? In the end, there is a woman on a banknote, but as we were discussing backstage, it felt like they'd found, you didn't suggest Jane Austen particularly, did you?
I didn't suggest Jane Austen, no.
But it did feel an element of, who's the white woman that we're all really comfortable with? Yeah. And let's go and look on Wikipedia and find a quote that's apparently from one of her books. Because, tell us about the quote, because it's not even her,
it's,
is it?
There is nothing I declare like reading, which, if anyone has ever read Jane Austen will know that was said by Caroline Bingley, who doesn't actually mean that at all, and she's only saying it to try and get Mr. Darcy. But I actually think that, contrary to what I think a lot of people said about Jane Austen, and I am in no doubt that was their reasoning for choosing Jane Austen, that she's a safe choice and that no one can object to her, and that she's, quite conservative. I think what I quite enjoy about that is this sort of idea that actually Jane Austen would just be laughing her arse off about that idea, because she was actually incredibly radical and totally proto-feminist, and also her work is so nuanced and so intelligent. I really put her up there with Shakespeare in terms of her use of language, and I find it very annoying when people dismiss her as chick lit, because actually she wasn't writing just about rich women getting husbands. She was talking about how women were trapped in society and how they had no choices. And the more you read her work, the more you realize how what she's actually doing is very cleverly presenting this as a very nice, very palatable story, and actually underneath it, it's all incredibly radical, political, agitating, really. But the quotation is very unfortunate. Although, if you were to read it properly, you would see, again, it's about women's lack of choices. So Mrs. Caroline Bingley, although she is this sort of laughable figure, on the other hand, you're meant to see how she's created, and she's made to be in this as this laughable figure, because that's what women are reduced to in this society that tells them that the only thing they're good for is marriage.
But I suspect the Bank of England committee didn't really think
I
of all
suspect
those
they
levels
didn't.
of irony.
I suspect they Googled Jane Austen reading quote.
Yes.
But yeah, and it's a real disappointment. The other thing, actually, the reason I think that Jane Austen's a fantastic choice is because she's actually really interested in the representation of women. And there were two quotes, if I'm allowed to say them, that I think would have been much better. Yeah. Is anyone from the Bank of England here? Can you change it? Okay, never mind. One of them is from Northanger Abbey, which is her first novel. And the heroine, Catherine Norland, is talking about history. And she says that she reads it a little as a duty, but it tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me. The quarrels of popes and kings, with wars or pestilences in every page, the men also good for nothing, and hardly any women at all. It is all very tiresome. And then in her last book, in Persuasion, again, this is the heroine, and she's talking to a guy about how he's saying women are also fickle and terrible, and he says, I can call up thousands of histories and poems and novels to support my argument. I don't think I've ever read any book where a woman isn't being inconstant. And she says that she won't accept books as examples, she won't accept them as evidence. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. Education has been theirs in so much higher a degree. The pen has been in their hands and will not allow books to prove anything. I think both of those would have been much better quotations. Yeah. But hopefully that illustrates how I think Jane Austen is often really misrepresented.
Tell me briefly about where things are on the marriage licensing.
David Cameron made a speech to say that they were going to bring it in, so mothers will be on licenses in the next year or so.
It's amazing that's not happened before. Good for you. I want to ask a bit about the challenge, and you talked very well, particularly Laura, about the challenge of where feminism goes. And crucially, the challenge of preaching to the converted, and I don't think I'm wrong in suspecting that most of the people here, I like to think all the people here have come here because they're into feminism, and I'm delighted to see lots of men and women, and of different ages too. How to broaden the audience, to bring about that kind of momentum where it's not acceptable to talk a certain way?
Well, I think there's several different things that we can do. The first thing is that social media is a way of reaching people who wouldn't necessarily come to an event like this. So specifically as an example, we have a lot of really high profile followers on social media like Simon Pegg, who quite often tweets about everyday sexism and says, it's everyone's problem, and says some quite helpful things. And he's reaching an audience of Simon Pegg fans. So he's reaching millions of probably, I would imagine, mostly male supporters who would never have heard of everyday sexism and who are hearing it through this mouthpiece of somebody that they respect and admire. So I think that social media can be really positive in that sense, but it's also limited, of course, because not everybody has access to the internet or is on social media, and that's why I believe passionately that it's so important that we get these issues into schools, because I do think it's just too important to leave to chance, and it's too important to leave to, these preachy women nagging on at me. It needs to be something that is just default, something that is so normal, and something that kids learn alongside learning about composting and calculators.
Default is a very good word, isn't it? Caroline, what's your view on preaching beyond the converted and broadening the...
I agree with Laura.
Surely not.
One thing that I found very interesting when I was studying behavioural science was how much everything that it talks about is so applicable to feminism, and I think that feminists would do very well to read about the findings of behavioural science. And one of the things I thought was particularly interesting was the concept of the messenger and the way that affects how the message is heard. And I think most feminists will have seen how, or not even feminists, there's that old trope about, there's another brilliant cartoon on this actually, I should have included it in the speech. So there's a group of people at a meeting, and the caption underneath, there's one woman and there's a load of guys, and the caption underneath is, "That's a very good suggestion, Miss Triggs. Perhaps one of the men in the room would like to make it." And it's funny because it's true, as Homer Simpson would say. And it is about this idea of the messenger, and that it does make a difference whether you respect the person who is telling you this thing. So I think it is about, encouraging a broad spectrum of people to talk about this and not to feel uncomfortable talking about it. And I do think that it's something that will come about a little bit naturally. People are less scared of saying they're feminists now because more and more people are saying it. So I'm hoping that it's just going to be a snowball thing.
I want to ask about the presentation of your work and ideas in the media. And both of you have talked about how the media can kind of choose to represent issues. And Laura, I have to say, I was struck by the Financial Times Weekend magazine cover. They interviewed you, and it was Lucy Kellaway who interviewed you, and you're on the cover. And the cover, I don't know if any of you have seen it. I tweeted it because I was concerned. The cover was a picture of you, head and shoulders, and yes, you look as you do, which is lovely. And then it said next to your, I think underneath it had your name, and then on the side the quote was, "I've had emails like, you should be very afraid, little girl, I'm going to get you." And I thought, why put that image on? It seemed to be the opposite of everything everyday sexism is about. And crucially, I was thinking of the audience of the Financial Times, which tends to be, affluent, middle and upper middle class, mostly white men who are very big in corporations. I don't know how you felt about it. The interview seemed quite sympathetic, but it was an odd cover for me, I thought.
Yeah, that exact same thing occurred to me as well, especially because inside there was a photograph that looked much more normal, and the photo that they chose to put on the front cover, I looked a bit kind of deer caught in the headlights. It was a kind of scared-looking picture. And it wasn't as if that had been the main focus of the interview. I think it just goes back to the way that we look at women, and the thing that was considered the most probably salacious item, the most headline-grabbing, the most eye-grabbing. They thought that was the most interesting thing. I mean, that interview was very interesting in terms of the portrayal of women, because Lucy Kellaway specifically talked about the fact that I was wearing a floral dress and I had long blonde hair, and she said, I'm going to tell the readers about this. And we had a really interesting discussion, which, to her credit, she included in the article.
And she showed that she was challenging her own assumptions that, as you'd said, both of you'd said, feminism sorted everything and sexism isn't as bad as it used to be. So she rethought it. I don't know what your view is on this, Caroline. I mean, particularly how often, because both of you are, often approached by the media, they're profiles of you, and how you feel what you're trying to do is represented and how you personally are represented.
Well, one thing that really annoys me is that the campaign for banknotes is always represented now as a campaign for Jane Austen to be on a banknote, which is annoying for two reasons. One, because I didn't choose Jane Austen, and two, because I feel it really trivializes the point of the campaign and completely saps it of the whole political point that I was trying to make, which is about female representation, not that I'm a Jane Austen fangirl, even though I am.
We've established that. Yes.
So that's kind of irritating, this sort of lazy shorthand thing. The other thing that I find really irritating about the media, and it's made me turn down actually a lot of media events, is this way that, in the same way that climate change actually is presented. So you've got to have this idea of balance, but it's a completely false idea of balance. So whenever you talk about feminism, you never get to talk about anything interesting because you're always having to establish that sexism actually exists. And it's just so ridiculous. There's no debate about this. You know, the stats speak for themselves about how women are underpaid, about how women are raped, about how women are beaten. There's just no question that women are not equal in this society. And I find it really irritating the way that the media seems to think we need to always just have the same discussion over and over again. So I've taken to saying to people who call me up and say, oh, do you want to come and talk about feminism? Am I going to have to defend the need for feminism? Yes. No, thank you. I'm hoping that eventually they'll be so desperate to have me on, they'll say, okay, we'll change the whole debate.
Yeah, but, no, that's a very good point about how the media tends to want to boil things down to, well, I call it infotainment, which is it can be very entertaining to have a feminist against someone who's, you know, really sexist.
But we've just
and there
seen
aren't
it
that
so
many of them, so the same people get wheeled out again and again and again to say, I love having my bum pinched. What are you making a fuss about?
That one.
And you have that same argument again, even to the extent that when Rashida Manjoo, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, came to the UK and said it was one of the most sexist countries that she had seen in her recent work, I had somebody on live radio asking me, is it more sexist than other countries? Like, the backlash was absolutely, you know, there was this absolutely simple kind of, look at this country where I can say one bad thing that happens to women, it's not more sexist. And I ended up genuinely having to answer the question with, well, I don't know, I'm not really qualified, I'm not an expert in comparing the oppression of women in different countries. If only there was someone who was that we could ask. You know? It was just crazy.
You both raised this issue of kind of creating these false comparisons. So why are you complaining about catcalling when there's female genital mutilation? And there was a very interesting piece, some of you may have read, by Michael White, who's a very senior Guardian writer, a man I have a lot of respect for. And he wrote this piece after the Lord Reynard allegations came out, when all those women had come forward about their experience of being sexually harassed and groped. And he wrote this long piece about, you know, in the good old days, you know, women like Barbara Castle and Shirley Williams, you know, they got important legislation through about equal pay, and they, you know, they weren't worried about if someone, you know, put a hand on them, they would, you know, sort of slap him off, and basically women, they should toughen up, and we've got female genital mutilation out there. I mean, the article ended that way. And a load of female MPs and journalists kind of laid into him. But it did seem to be an amazing example of a kind of combination of mansplaining and this strange joining together of one very serious set of crimes to diminish any discussion about the impact of sexual harassment in a place like Parliament. I don't know what your thoughts are about that. And if we've got anywhere since.
With what?
Well, just in terms of, do you think that there's now an acceptance that what happened with Lord Reynard actually was unacceptable, that women shouldn't have been able to?
We have reached that at all. People are still going on about, you know, all these women whining about something irrelevant. I think there's so much to unpack in what's going on there. One of them is the way in which women, everything to do with femalehood, again, you can see it in Jane Austen, is dismissed as trivial. And I think that's part of it, this idea that sexism is just women whining, whereas any other kind of oppression tends to be taken a bit more seriously. Even if it still exists and we don't really do anything about it, at least we tend to accept that it exists, whereas sexism is just women whining. And I think there's partly this idea of triviality that underpins a lot of these issues. The issue of equal pay, I think, is actually very interesting. Oh, they passed equal pay legislation. Yes, except 40 years later, we still don't have equal pay. Could that perhaps be because cultural change needs to happen as well as legislative change? I don't know, Michael. And then finally, this idea of everything being compared to FGM, which I think, again, sort of would tie into the point I just made about cultural change, is that, you know, and in fact, everything that Laura's saying in her speech is that you have to change the entire culture. You can't just say, let's stop FGM, or let's stop violence against women, and somehow it will happen. You need to change the way in which women are perceived so that it's seen as okay to perform FGM on them, or it's seen okay as okay to rape them, even though, of course, everyone claims it's not okay to rape women, and yet women are raped, what was it, every 6 minutes? So clearly some people think it's okay. So yeah, I think that it's a total failure to examine the structure of society in which atrocities like FGM and beheadings take place.
But it's also a straw argument that's not used anywhere else. Nobody says the police should stop looking at any fraud cases because they haven't solved all the murders. It's something that you don't realise how ridiculous these things are until you compare them like that. And it's something that only happens with women. You know, any reason for why you shouldn't be allowed to talk about this. But also this kind of hilarious, patronising idea that we can't care about very many different things at once. Yeah. You know, British feminists are fighting FGM. They're fighting rape and domestic violence, and they're fighting page 3. And there's a huge strength in tackling all of these issues. But also, most of all, it goes back to that complete diminishing of what women are facing. The fact that what they are describing, the allegations that women were talking about, were about being sexually groped. They were allegations of sexual assault. And yet we live in a country where countless media outlets are able to have debates about things like, as they did on The Right Stuff, is, you know, somebody pinching your bottom just a bit of fun? Where we're able to debate, as they did on BBC Free Speech, if a woman goes out wearing a short skirt, is she asking for it? You know, we're able to trivialise these things because they're just not taken seriously, and so the debate's all wrong.
I want to ask one last question before opening it up to the audience, which is about class and feminism. And there's two aspects. One is, I think it's something that both of you have had thrown at you, which is, oh, you know, you're middle class and affluent, and therefore, you know, park your privilege and all the rest of it. But also, I just made a film in Rotherham with survivors of the abuse there, and I will give a plug for it. It's on iPlayer. It was a BBC Inside Out programme. If you do a search for BBC Inside Out Rotherham Samira, you'll find it. And I was shocked because, well, one, those girls are getting no support from anyone still, and not one of their abusers has been arrested yet, even now. But also, I felt, because they were all working class, they and their families were treated with a particular disdain by police, by social workers, by everybody. And I'm not trying to slag off all the police and all the social workers. There are obviously people who are trying to help them. But there was this perception, well, they're slags, aren't they? And one mother said to me her daughter was only being abused after she was put into care. And the mother had only got her into care because she was trying to stop her going off the rails. And the social worker said to her, it's her choice. You know, it's what she wants to do. And she was 11 or 12. And there was this assumption that she could make adult choices about sex life with men who were 10 years older. And I just wondered what your thoughts were just about the whole aspect of class and feminism. Sorry, I went off on one a bit, but...
Shall I go?
Okay, go for it.
I think this is massively important, and I knew from our sneak preview that you were going to ask this question. So one of the things that I took out of my speech that I wanted to talk about is this idea of intersectionality and the fact that these different aspects of different forms of prejudice are intersecting with the gender prejudice that women are facing. And that's the other thing that's come out so clearly from the Everyday Sexism Project entries, that we're not just hearing about women who are experiencing sexism. We're hearing from a woman working behind a bar who says that the white women who work with her get standard sexual harassment. She gets asked to twerk. We're hearing from a disabled woman sitting in a wheelchair who's catcalled by men across the street, but they're not just catcalling her, they're shouting, if you're just going to sit there, you might as well get your tits out. We're hearing from women who are in lesbian couples who are going down the street with men shouting from behind them, I've got something that will turn you straight, or can I watch? These women who are just sort of experiencing a hierarchy of oppression, different types of oppression intersecting with each other, and it's the same with class. And it is just so clear, just like you said, not just from Rotherham, but also from Rochdale, that these young women were systematically failed by a system that didn't assign any value to them, and that there was that absolute sense that they're making a choice. The same thing happened in Rochdale with a girl who was 15, who went to the police and social services with her family looking for help, and they said she was making a choice, the same exact phrase.
Yeah, that's what all the women
and
are
also that countdown, you know, it's nearly her 16th birthday, even though what you were talking about was rape. And I think that we have to look at how that's built into the way that we're tackling it. If we want to talk about feminism and where feminism is going, that we have to look at ways that these things are included in the campaigning that we're doing, the discussions that we're having.
I guess the schools thing of yours is a great example.
The schools thing is a massive example. And in fact, if you look at the report that came out of Rotherham, one of the things that was massively highlighted in that was that the young women who had been involved all were completely derisive about the level of sex and relationships education that they'd received. And that's something that we so often don't think about. When we talk about sex ed, we so often get this feedback of, oh, I don't want my child exposed to it. But in reality, you're talking about a huge number of children who are already experiencing abuse and might not ever have got the idea that it wasn't something normalized unless we put it in the classroom. And the same goes for so many of these different areas that we're looking at, that it's not just about the pay gap, it's also about the fact that black and minority ethnic women are paid far less than white women. It's not just about tribunal fees, it's about the fact that that's impacting even more on women who are single mothers, on low-paid women. It's about the housing tax, it's about all of these kinds of intersecting issues, and I think we have to look at how to build that into our feminism.
Karen, did you have any thoughts, or will open up to questions at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the main thing I would say is that it's just sort of repeating what Laura's saying, really, about the way that women who suffer more oppressions than simply their gender. The gender, it's not just that they also suffer the extra oppressions, it's that the gender oppression tends to be worse as well. So,
but I wonder if you could take on the other aspect of the question, which is then it's thrown back at you as if, oh, well, you know, what are you doing about it? You're so comfortably off because you're both middle class and whatever. I mean, you know, in a way, that's something which is used against you, isn't it, sometimes? I wonder how you then...
Well, I mean, I really read that very much as, well, first of all, you know, I don't think that that's necessarily something you can just completely ignore, because there's no denying the fact that the vast majority of feminists who do have a platform are much more likely to be white and middle class than any other demographic. So there is a case to be answered there. But I think that the way that you know, feminists like me and Laura have to respond to that is trying to amplify the voices of women who are less lucky than we are. That's what I try to do anyway. But I think also there is this sense of that sort of trivialization aspect. So unless if it's just gender that oppresses you, then somehow it's not real. So someone tweeted me the other day, I thought it was a really interesting example of this. He said, oh, women's studies is like a rich white girl version of an MBA. And it's just this idea, again, that these sort of rich, privileged women, there's nothing really that happens to them. They don't get raped, they don't get paid less, nothing terrible happens, might be a slap on the arse every now and then. So they're like dilettantes, and they go and spend their time, you know, quaffing champagne and talking about how terrible it was this man once mansplained to them. Obviously, that's not true. You're just as likely to get raped, no matter what demographic of female you are. The only thing that matters is that you have a vagina. So there's
an interesting example.
There's that issue. But I did just want to say something, because it made me really angry today. I saw an advert by a pro-life charity, which had a picture of a dog and a picture of a fetus, and said, why is this dog so important that we'd want to look after it, but a fetus we can just sort of get rid of it? It was meant to be this sort of really powerful statement. But of course the reality is that women die from illegal abortions all around the world, particularly poor women and women from the global south, because actually rich privileged women are always able to get an abortion. They're able to fly out of the country to somewhere where it's legal, or they're able to get it on the private health service. A really interesting example of this is El Salvador, where it's illegal, and women who have to use the national provision they can't have abortions if they have miscarriages. There's loads of women who have had miscarriages and have been imprisoned for like 40 years as a result. But the rich women, there are statistics about how much abortion is being carried out in private hospitals that are being paid for. So a lot of these issues, if you have power and privilege and money and education, you can't escape things like being raped, you can't escape things like domestic violence, but when it comes to legislation that particularly attacks and discriminates against women, you have a much higher chance of being able to escape that if you have money and if you have education. So I think that's a really, really important part of it, and the reason I brought up that pro-life thing is just that I think it's absolutely perverse to call yourself pro-life when it is clearly demonstrated again and again and again that in countries where abortion is not illegal, in countries where abortion is illegal, abortion rates go up, and also deaths of women who are pregnant go up. Okay, so
let's take some questions. We have some roving microphones, and if you want to say, if you're from an organisation or anything, feel free to say. I'll take the lady down the front here first. Where are our mics? Now, they are very directional mics, so when you hold it, you actually really have to hold it pointing at yourself, and about 6 inches away.
Thank you. So many jokes that I want to say right now about the 6 inches comment, but I won't. I need help from hopefully you three or someone in the audience. And I'm ashamed to say I need help more with my female friends than with my male. I need help with this word, this fucking F word, feminism. Because I tell you, forgive me, I'm feeling a bit emotional. I'm going through something at the moment which makes this particularly relevant, but every single time I say to a girlfriend of mine, hell yeah, I'm a feminist, and why aren't you? They go, oh, well, okay, Hills, enjoy yourself, run along now. Whereas more often than not, when I talk to men about it, they are at least sympathetic or willing to listen. What do we do as women about this word when we're talking to other women?
And may I ask about how old you are? So
I'm 35.
Right.
I just said that in front of a room full of people.
Yeah, that's okay. No, I'm always interested because I'm 46, and so I grew up with second wave feminism, and in the 80s, I mean, men's groups were being set up. So I'm interested that I would have thought your sort of feminism would be an okay word for older women.
And interestingly, what makes it even worse is that I have some young women who work for me, and they're even more terrified of the word, and I weep.
Yeah, no, that's a great question to start us off with, the F word itself.
Who wants to
go first? Do you want to go first on that one?
Okay. I think it's about being able to represent feminism fairly. I think it's had a really, really rough ride in the media. Certainly when I was growing up, I thought feminism was just ridiculous, loads of whiny women, and they were just really embarrassing. And the reality is that women are brought up to want men to like them. Whether or not you're a lesbian, you are taught that men are the ones who are in power, and therefore it's important what they think of you. And the message is that men won't like you if you're a feminist. They'll think you're annoying, they'll think you're whiny, they'll think you're trivial. So I think it's very understandable that women can be very, very anti-feminist in their responses. I think often if you manage to get these women to talk and you say, well, do you like voting? Do you like not having to be raped? Do you like your bodily boundaries being respected? They're like, well, yeah, obviously. Well, then you're a feminist. And I think that one thing that's really important about the word feminism, and people often say, oh, I'm not a feminist, I'm a humanist. You know, let's just all be equal. For a start, humanism is not actually about humans. It's a philosophical genre, whatever. Anyway, but secondly, the reason that we use the word feminism is because it names a problem. And the problem is that women aren't equal yet. And until women aren't equal, we're going to need the word feminism. Unfortunately, while women are still unequal, people are not going to like the word feminism because it's simply, when people reject the word feminism, it's an example of the way in which we're sexist. So that's not really very helpful to you, I'm afraid. I think it's just a case of, plugging on and understanding where they're coming from. I think it comes from a place of fear rather than a place of being obtuse.
What about for you, Laura?
Yeah, I think I agree that it comes so specifically from this idea that has been so promoted that feminism means all these things it doesn't mean. And maybe if you can dig down and find out which one of those it is that they think, then it could be something that you could sort of set right. You see these people, there was this interview with Marissa Mayer, the CEO of Yahoo, and they asked her if she was a feminist, and she said no. And she explained that the reason why was because she wasn't militant and she didn't have a chip on her shoulder. And you kind of think, okay, well, let me just tell you that being a feminist doesn't necessarily mean those things. I think that in a way it might be worth just very bluntly asking them, can I ask you why you don't think you are? And quite often that kind of cyclically resolves the issue. I had a conversation really similarly with a group of 16-year-old girls in school the other day, and there was about 20 of them, and I asked them if they were feminists, and only one of them said that she was. And I said, okay, well, can I ask you why? And they said, because feminism means, women being better than men, because we're already equal, and we don't think that, and we don't think that women should be any better. This is the same group of girls who told me when I confronted them with the gender pay gap as an example, that probably women just weren't that good at jobs as men. Yeah, 16-year-old girls.
Sounds like my boss.
Yeah. So basically, we talked through it, and I said, do you think there's any way in the media in which women are treated differently than men? They were like, oh, God, yeah, Miley Cyrus, they say this and this about her body and this about... And then I said, do you experience any differences from how your male friends at school are treated? And they had millions of examples. They said that they were called sluts and slags more often than their male peers would use their names. And I just kept asking them, and I asked them, what about politics? And they said, politics is basically for men. And then I just brought them back and said, so do you still think that everything's equal and okay? And they kind of went, oh, no. And sometimes I think it is that simple. And if you literally just ask whatever it is about feminism that makes them think they're not one, I guarantee won't be a thing about feminism. I do feel positive. I feel hope that we're coming back to the simplicity.
I just wanted to say that chip on the shoulder, though, I think that's such a good example of the way in which the issues that women face are so trivialized. Chip on a shoulder suggests it's nothing to worry about, and it's all made up for yourself, and you've just got an attitude problem. And to me, that is Marissa Mayer saying, I'm cool, guys, don't worry, I'm not going to be really annoying and like introduce female quotas or anything like that. I'm not going to rock the boat.
Right, can I take the... is there a lady on the end there? I'll take you on the end there with the glasses first. Yes, thank you. We'll get around to all of you. Yes, right in the middle there.
Like that, okay.
And then I'll take these two. And those may have to be our last, depending on timing. So remember who you are. I know you're on this side. Go ahead.
I wanted to talk about Emma Watson's speech at the United Nations. My friends and I have been chatting about this a lot, and although, great to have feminism on the global platform, and that sort of trying to get men involved is always helpful. The more I've thought about it, the more I've realized how much she had to justify women's issues by bringing men's issues into it. And then that whole he for she campaign where women can't even sign up for it, it feels to me like they're taking the femme out of feminism. And I wanted to know your thoughts on that speech and the he for she campaign.
So what was the name of the campaign again?
Is that he for she campaign?
Okay. It's an interesting one, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Emma Watson's speech.
I think there's been some really valid criticisms of the speech. There's been valid criticisms of the idea of a campaign and whether or not Emma Watson is representative enough of women around the world, and criticisms, as you said, of trying to persuade men to be on board because it hurts you too, instead of because you bloody well should. And I think that's, really valid. But I also have a very pragmatic approach to this, which is that we need to get as many people on board as quickly as we possibly can. And if we go around tearing down everybody that's making an effort on a global stage, people will be terrified to come forward. And it is right and necessary that we do have those critiques. But at the same time, I think if it means that there are billions of people around the world who've perhaps changed their idea about feminism, who might be thinking about these issues for the first time as a kind of gateway to feminism, I think that we need as many people as we possibly can as quickly as we can.
Caroline.
Yeah, I think Laura's right on the whole gateway to feminism idea, and I think any way that you can get someone to start reading up on it and being interested in it is a positive thing. That said, I think it's incredibly sad and demonstrates a very low opinion of men to think that the only way you could be interested is if suddenly you realize, oh, you mean that feminism means I can cry? I'm in, guys. The rape wasn't interesting, but the crying thing, that really got me. The one thing I do disagree with Laura on, however, just to, is this the final question that I'm going to disagree with Laura? Is that I actually completely disagree with the idea of Emma Watson not being sufficiently representative. No one man is ever expected to represent all women, but every time you have a woman stand up and talk, everyone says, oh, well, she doesn't represent me, she doesn't represent you. This is all because of this whole idea that women are meant to represent all women. They come from Planet Woman, we're all the same, so therefore this woman should represent all women. You never hear this from a man. You never hear that this man who stood up and made this speech isn't representative enough. Of course he's not. He's one man. He represents himself. So I think that we need to be very careful about, criticizing a woman because she's the wrong type of woman. She's a woman, and that makes her the right type of woman. What we need is more women, and more women from all around the world, and from all classes, and from all backgrounds, to be able to stand up, not to say that those particular women don't represent enough people. I think that it's about this idea of everyone needing to join in, and there should be no one who should be excluded on the basis of who they are.
Lovely. I'll take the one at the front next, and then I'll pick you, Sarah. Got down the very front.
Actually, my question follows on from the one that you just had. And it was to talk about default man. And Grayson Perry's written a piece of the New Statesman this week, which is all about challenging the notion of white middle-class man as being the default. And it is a wonderful piece in many ways. And I sent this to a male friend of mine. I said, hey, look how wonderful this is. And he sent me this long email saying, I just don't understand. You need to explain. I feel attacked. I feel hurt. Why did you send this to me? What do you want me to do with it? And it really got me thinking, and I thought, yeah, if we were in a power dynamic, men and women, and if we want to shift it, we both have to shift. Mm-hmm. So how do we make men shift?
Good question.
It's a simple question to
That's
end
like
on.
a really horrible question.
I think it's partly about making it really clear what it is that we're asking for, because I think that knee-jerk response comes from a defensive place. I think that there's an automatic knee-jerk response of, you must be criticizing me. You know, if you're talking about feminism or if you're talking about men in general, you must be implying that I am, whatever it is. You know, people respond to the Page 3 campaign in this way by saying, oh, you're implying that I'm a sleaze. Or people imply to a campaign about sexism by going, oh, you're implying that I'm a sexist. And I think we have to get beyond that by making it really clear that we're not suggesting that you personally are necessarily part of the problem, but it isn't possible to be in the middle ground. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. And I think we have to present it in that way, you know, that this is not about saying that all men are sexist, it's not about attacking all men, but it is about saying that if you don't want to be in that camp, you have to put your money where your mouth is and you have to get involved in standing up.
I think it's about, you know, returning to a class analysis of gender and really making clear that this is about men as a class and women as a class, not individual men and women. I think that neoliberalism has been a terrible, terrible thing for feminism because it makes people think in this very individualistic, my personal choices way, rather than structurally and about the structures that are imposed on a certain class of people. So I think it's about being very clear that that's what feminism is about. It's about addressing the way in which men as a class and women as a class are expected to behave and the ways in which they are treated. And I think a very, you know, this is very important for combating that famous meme, not all men. Every time you say anything about, you know, let's say, no, it's 91% of violent crime is committed by men, but not all men. Yes, I know, that's why I said 91%, not 100%. So there is this problem of men feeling attacked, and I really think that the best way of combating that is about making it clear that we're talking about women as a class and men as a class. And also I think about being very clear that this is, yes, men are going to need to change as well, and that's why I don't think that Emma Watts's speech is so awful, because it's showing that change doesn't have to be terrible. But also it's about making clear that the focus on feminism really is about women. That's why it's called feminism. It's about liberating women from oppression, not about, you know, making females, you know, not about female supremacy. It's about liberating us, and that's hopefully not so scary, but I don't know.
Question from the second row, and that I think will have to be our last one, I'm afraid.
Hi, I'm a student at LSE, so obviously...
Where, for those who don't know, there's is it a male rugby
so there was
club?
a leaflet that was sent around the Freshers' Fair last Thursday and Friday from the men's rugby club, and was just horrifically sexist, homophobic and racist, and they got called up on it, and there's been a lot of accounts earlier of them doing horrendous things, and now they've been disbanded as a club. And even though the SU and the university as a whole has tried really hard to kind of combat the issue that's gone on, and the Women's Society and the LGBT Society has done a lot as well, we're still unsure as to how to approach the situation and what to do about it. You know, how should we help these men in this rugby club who've said these horrendous things? And I was just wondering if you could offer any advice to LSE as a whole.
I was
as to
wondering if
how
Boris
to approach
Johnson and
it.
David Cameron and George Osborne, who are all members of the Bullingdon, might have some ideas about what support they could
Yeah, well, because they're doing really well. Yeah. So.
But it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it is a case of a university governing body intervening very fast and acting very quickly. But straight away, you're right, there's a sense of, actually, I'm sure for those men, it feels like an assault, doesn't it?
I mean, certainly the reaction that I've had on Twitter when I've tweeted about it, I've had various LSE ex-rugby and rugby boys getting in touch, being very angry about the whole situation, as if I had decided to disband the rugby club. It was me, I admit. I'm the evil feminist behind everything. So I don't know. It's really hard. How do you stop someone from feeling personally attacked? I think the only way is, I know I keep repeating this, but to appeal to people's sense of humanity. Women are human. You know, when you treat us like objects, you know, people of colour are human as well. All these things that they did. I mean, they, for those who don't know, they had, in the recent past, a Nazi-themed party where a Jewish student was assaulted. They blacked up and dressed up as Guantanamo Bay inmates in order to mock Muslim students coming out of Friday-Perez. So this is not just about women, it's about pretty much everyone who isn't a straight white guy. And I guess it's about appealing to a sense of common humanity and saying this isn't about attacking you, it's about saying that we want to be seen as human beings as well. Is that such a dreadful thing to ask?
I think it should be about attacking them as well. Surely, like, if we're talking about those individuals, like, you know, they need to feel absolutely under attack for doing this, those men in that rugby club. That's what we're talking about with this idea of what's normalised and acceptable in society. They need that reaction. And it doesn't happen enough, and I fear it may have happened in this case because it was such a high-profile media case. But, you know, we've also seen, literally this week, there's been the Nottingham University first years who were all taught a chant, it's been reported in the press, you can Google it, about necrophilia and about, you know, not just horrible and incredibly aggressive stuff about having sex with women, but also about digging them up and having sex, just really. And then there's been Emmanuel College in Cambridge, the student newspaper there, the Tab, has reported an email sent round to a drinking society about smashing the girls. And I mean, this is the tip of the iceberg. If you look at the stories that have come out in the last year from universities, it's a complete and utter epidemic. And I think it has to be cracked down on. I think they deserve to feel completely
Well, in a way, it's amazing
attacked.
how many years they'd clearly been operating.
Yeah,
and
well,
people must have
exactly.
known.
And these stories come out every year. Look at last year, there was the Leeds Freshers Night, which was Freshers Violation, advertised with a video on YouTube about raping a fresher. There was the Cardiff Metropolitan University Freshers poster, which had on it the words, "I was raping a woman last night and she cried." There was the Durham rugby team who were playing a drinking game called It's Only Rape If. There was the rugby club that went out at Aberystwyth University wearing casual rape t-shirts. I mean, these are not isolated incidents. This is a massive problem. I think it is about reacting with shock and anger and taking action and disbanding the team and making it clear that this is absolutely unacceptable.
And it comes back to this idea that it starts with your experience and report it.
Yeah.
Did you want to come back in there?
Yeah, I obviously agree with that, but I think there's a difference between reacting with anger and shock and accepting that they're being attacked. The problem I have with this idea that they're being attacked is it makes them into the victim. They're not the victim in this case. The people that they have been homophobic to and racist to and sexist to, they're the victims. So the reason that I think it's important to counter this narrative of, oh, poor me, little homophobic, racist, misogynist, I'm being attacked, is to say, no, you're not being attacked, and also because attacking makes it seem like not only we're the aggressor, but we're an irrational aggressor as well. And actually this is an incredibly rational response to homophobia and racism and misogyny, is to get angry and to say this isn't okay. So this is why I think it is actually, although it is fine and also good even to get angry about this kind of stuff, it is very important to counter the attacking narrative because that enables them to claim to be a victim, and they are most certainly not victims.
Yes. Terrific thoughts. I wanted to end with one anecdote of mine, which was my nephews go to a very impressive academic school. It happens to be all boys. And they were sent a reading list, and on the reading list was The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And it had a little one-line plot summary of all the books on the list, and the plot summary for it was a chilling dystopian vision of a world ruled by women. And my sister-in-law emailed it to me, and she said, Samira, have I gone mad, or is this the book that I thought I'd read? and I said no, and if you don't challenge the teachers on it, I will go public on this. So she did, and I interviewed Margaret Atwood about a month ago, and I told her, and she tweeted it. It was hilarious. So sometimes it's a small thing, but I thought, wasn't it significant that that school had just set that on a list to a whole load of young men who were all being prepared for kind of top universities and to go out and run things. And just, it seems little, but you're right, none of these things are. I'm just so delighted that you could both be here to give us such a wonderful conversation. And thank you for your terrific questions. Don't forget Laura's signing her book at the back. And thank you again for coming.